Judge Walter Grayson barely looked up from his case file, already bored. Another young defendant, another open and shut case. Grand theft auto and resisting arrest, he sighed, adjusting his glasses. Let's not waste time, kid. Do you have a lawyer, or are we pretending you can defend yourself? Laughter rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff smirked. The prosecutor folded his arms, already waiting for the guilty verdict. But Jalen Dawson didn't flinch. He stood tall, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Actually, Your Honor, I'd like to represent myself. Silence. Judge Grayson chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, this'll be good. The courtroom waited for the inevitable disaster. But then Jalen took his first step forward. And with the first sentence out of his mouth, the entire courtroom shifted. Because Jalen wasn't just another clueless teenager. He had come prepared. And what he was about to reveal wouldn't just change his own fate, it would shake the entire courtroom to its core. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs, the kind of restrained chatter that signaled anticipation rather than chaos. Rows of spectators filled the gallery, some leaning forward, others whispering among themselves. They had come to witness another routine case, another quick conviction. At the center of it all, standing alone at the defendant's table, was Jalen Dawson, 19 years old, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. He looked calm, too calm for a kid facing serious charges. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his cheap slacks, his posture relaxed but alert. There was no nervous fidgeting, no frantic glances at the jury or the judge. He stood still, waiting. Across from him, Judge Walter Grayson sighed, flipping lazily through the case file. The overhead lights reflected off his glasses as he scanned the pages with thinly veiled boredom. He had seen hundreds of cases like this before. Young, black, charged with a crime. He didn't need to hear a single word to know how this would end. With a flick of his wrist, he shut the folder and leaned back in his chair. All right, let's make this quick, he muttered, rubbing his temple. I've got a golf game at 2. A chuckle rippled through the courtroom. Not loud, not rowdy, just enough for Jalen to notice the smirks on the bailiff's face and the amused glance the prosecutor shot toward the jury. They all thought this was already over. The prosecutor, Mitchell Carrington, stood with the confidence of a man who had already won. His suit was expensive, his tie knotted to perfection, and his voice carried that sharp, rehearsed tone of someone who had delivered the same argument 100 times before. Your Honor, Carrington began, pacing slightly. This is a simple case. The defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed inside a stolen vehicle. He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. The car, a 2022 Audi A6, was reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, and there is no doubt that the defendant was in possession of stolen property. The audience shifted, murmuring in quiet agreement. Judge Grayson let out a bored sigh. Seems straightforward to me. But then Carrington took a deliberate step toward Jalen's table. The defense may try to convince you that this was all just a misunderstanding, Carrington said, turning toward the jury with a mocking smile. That Jalen Dawson is just an unfortunate victim of circumstance. His eyes locked onto Jalen's for the first time. But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police? The words hung in the air. The tension thickened. The jury members sat still, processing the carefully chosen words. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. He was waiting for the moment every defendant reached. That moment of fear, panic, or desperation. But Jalen didn't blink. He didn't stammer. He didn't plead. Instead, he tilted his head just slightly, as if considering something. And then, he smiled. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, slightly thrown off. Defense? He said, turning toward Jalen's lawyer, Lisa Thornton. A public defender, underpaid, overworked, and barely invested. She had barely spoken 3 words since the trial started. She stood up hesitantly. Your Honor, my client. Jalen placed a hand on her arm. A silent request. Lisa froze, blinking at him in confusion. Then, after a pause, she slowly sat back down. The courtroom held its breath. Jalen took a step forward, standing tall, facing the judge directly. His voice was calm, steady, controlled. I'll be representing myself, Your Honor. Silence. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. A woman in the jury whispered something under her breath. Judge Grayson actually laughed. Excuse me? He said, his smirk widening. Did I hear that right? I said, Jalen repeated. his tone unshaken. "I'll be defending myself." The murmurs turned into whispers. Carrington let out a sharp chuckle, shaking his head. "This should be interesting." Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. "Oh, I have to hear this." The gallery watched, waiting for a train wreck. They all expected Jay with Jalen to crumble, to slip up, to stammer, to make a fool of himself. But Jalen had been waiting for this moment his entire life. He took a slow breath, and then, with his first words, the entire mood of the courtroom shifted. Because Jalen wasn't just another kid trying to talk his way out of trouble. He knew what he was doing, and what he was about to say would change everything. The courtroom was silent, but the tension in the air wasn't. Every pair of eyes was locked on Jalen Dawson, the 19-year-old defendant who had just declared that he would be representing himself. Judge Walter Grayson leaned back in his chair, an amused smirk on his face. "All right then, Mr. Dawson," he said, mocking the formality. "Let's hear it. You have the floor." Across the room, Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington folded his arms, watching Jalen like he was waiting for him to fall flat on his face. Jalen took his time. He adjusted his stance, exhaled slowly, then turned toward Carrington with a look that was far too confident for someone facing years in prison. "You said," Jalen began, his voice even and steady, "that Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct?" Carrington barely hesitated. "That's right," he said, nodding. "His testimony states that he saw you in the vehicle before attempting to flee." Jalen gave the smallest nod, almost like he was agreeing. Then, he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss Officer Ruiz's testimony as evidence." A ripple of confusion passed through the courtroom. Even the bailiff furrowed his brows, shifting slightly. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" Jalen tilted his head, letting the moment stretch just a little longer before delivering his answer. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car." A low murmur spread across the gallery. Carrington's expression flickered, but he quickly covered it with a forced smirk. "That's an interesting claim, Mr. Dawson," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "But Officer Ruiz wrote a detailed report confirming that he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." Jalen interrupted. Dead silence. Carrington's mouth stopped mid-sentence. Judge Grayson's smirk twitched. Just barely, but it was there. The prosecutor cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. "I don't know where you're getting that from, but I can assure you, Officer Ruiz—" "Your Honor," Jalen said, turning his full attention back to the judge. "If the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request for Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history." But he let the pause hang there, just long enough for the courtroom to feel it. "I have a feeling it won't." The gallery erupted. Gasps, murmurs. A woman in the jury shifted in her seat. Someone whispered, "Wait, can he do that?" Judge Grayson's face darkened slightly, but he quickly masked it. "Counselor," he said, turning to Carrington, "does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Carrington froze. It was only for a second, but Jalen saw it, and more importantly, the jury saw it too. It was that 1-second hesitation that changed everything. Jalen didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He just waited. Finally, Carrington forced himself to nod. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time since the trial started, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. For the first time since the trial began, the energy in the courtroom shifted. Jalen Dawson wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was dismantling the prosecution's case, piece by piece. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington had tried to brush off the GPS request, but the jury had already noticed his hesitation. And Jalen? Jalen was just getting started. He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm, steady. "Before we move forward, I'd like to submit one more piece of evidence into the record." Judge Walter Grayson, who had once looked bored by the case, now watched Jalen carefully, his fingers drumming lightly against the bench. Carrington scoffed. "More theatrics?" Jalen didn't react. Instead, he reached into his folder and pulled out a single piece of paper. It wasn't thick like the case files on the prosecution's desk. It wasn't stacked with legal jargon. It was one statement, one paragraph, one signature, and it was about to change everything. Jalen turned to face the jury, lifting the document for them to see. "This," he said, "is the original statement from the owner of the vehicle, Raymond Whitaker." The courtroom stilled. Even Judge Grayson's fingers stopped tapping. Carrington's jaw tightened, but he quickly forced a chuckle. "Nice try." That's already been submitted. Mr. Whitaker confirmed his car was stolen. By you. Jalen took a step forward. No, he said evenly. He didn't. A pause. Then, slowly, Jalen unfolded the paper. Allow me to read the part that somehow never made it into the prosecution's filings. He glanced at Carrington just long enough to see the way his eyes narrowed, the way his shoulders stiffened. Then, Jalen read the words aloud, words that would change the entire case. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. Silence. For half a second, it was like the entire courtroom forgot how to breathe. Then, chaos. Gasps. Murmurs. The sound of people shifting in their seats. A woman in the jury covered her mouth. Someone in the gallery whispered, "No way." Carrington's face went pale. Judge Grayson's fingers curled against the bench. Jalen let the moment breathe. Then, he turned back to the prosecution, his expression unreadable. Would you like me to read it again? Carrington's mouth opened, then closed. He was scrambling, panicking, because this wasn't supposed to happen. This statement, this crucial piece of evidence, it was never meant to see the light of day. Judge Grayson finally cleared his throat, his voice tighter than before. Mr. Carrington, he said, leaning forward slightly. Why wasn't this included in the prosecution's filings? Carrington swallowed. Your Honor, the police report. The police report left this out, Jalen interrupted, his tone razor-sharp. Which means the police either ignored it, he let that sit for a second, or they buried it. The courtroom erupted again. Judge Grayson's jaw tightened. He could feel control slipping through his fingers. Carrington flipped through his papers, his hands shaking just slightly. This doesn't prove anything, he snapped. Even if Mr. Whitaker saw someone else take his car, that doesn't explain why your fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. Jalen gave a small nod, like he'd been waiting for that exact response. True, he admitted. Which is why we should probably talk about that next. And just like that, the foundation of the case was crumbling beneath the prosecution's feet. The courtroom wasn't the same anymore. The confident smirks? Gone. The prosecutor's rehearsed arrogance? Cracked. The judge's dismissive attitude? Fading into unease. Jalen Dawson wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was winning. And now, he was about to deliver the next blow. Jalen turned his attention to the prosecution's side of the courtroom. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady. I'd like to call my next witness. Judge Walter Grayson, who had been tapping his fingers against the bench more than usual, let out a slow breath. Proceed, he muttered. Jalen nodded. I'd like to question the arresting officer, Detective Daniel Ruiz. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as the officer made his way to the stand. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Ruiz was a seasoned officer, mid-40s, broad shoulders, neatly pressed uniform. He had taken the stand many times before, given testimony, helped secure dozens of convictions. But today felt different. Today he wasn't backed by the system. Today he was about to be exposed by a 19-year-old. As soon as Ruiz sat down, Jalen approached. The silence in the room was thick, waiting to be broken. Jalen didn't waste time. Detective Ruiz, he said, calm but firm. Can you confirm, under oath, that you personally witnessed me behind the wheel of the stolen car? Ruiz didn't hesitate. Yes, I did. Jalen nodded, expression unreadable. And you included that in your report? Yes. You're absolutely sure? Yes. Jalen paused. Then, slowly, he turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit the GPS records from Detective Ruiz's patrol car into evidence. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Grayson sat up a little straighter. Carrington visibly tensed. Ruiz didn't move, but his jaw tightened, just slightly. Jalen took his time walking back to his table, picking up a file and flipping it open. Then he held up printed documents for everyone to see. These records, he said, voice carrying through the courtroom, show the exact location of Detective Ruiz's patrol car on the night of my arrest. He turned to Ruiz, locking eyes with him. Detective, could you tell the court the exact time you claim to have seen me behind the wheel? Ruiz's throat bobbed slightly. Around 9:15 p.m. Jalen nodded. Right, he said, flipping to another page. And yet, according to official GPS records, at 9:15 p.m., your vehicle was... He let the words hang for effect. 4 miles away from the crime scene. The courtroom exploded. Murmurs turned to outright gasps. A woman in the jury shook her head in disbelief. Judge Grayson rubbed his forehead, suddenly looking exhausted. Carrington shot up from his seat. This is absurd, he barked. GPS can be inaccurate. Jalen didn't even turn to acknowledge him. Instead, he leaned forward onto the witness stand, voice low and deliberate. Detective Ruiz, he said, can you explain why your GPS data says you weren't anywhere near the scene, but your report claims you saw me inside the car? Ruiz opened his mouth, then closed it. The pause was longer than it should have been. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. Judge Grayson noticed. Jalen took a step back, arms crossed. No answer? Ruiz exhaled sharply, shifting in his seat. Maybe the logs weren't updated properly. Jalen tilted his head slightly. The logs, he repeated. Or your report. Ruiz's silence was deafening. Even the judge, who had mocked Jalen in the beginning, was watching Ruiz like he was seeing him for the first time. Carrington, desperate, cut in again. Your Honor, the defendant is trying to confuse the court with technicalities. Jalen spoke over him, voice sharper now. Technicalities like a police officer lying on an official report? More gasps. Jalen turned back to Ruiz. You can't explain the GPS data, so let me ask you this. He leaned in. Where were you that night? Ruiz was visibly sweating now. His polished confidence, gone. His prepared script, useless. Because he knew what everyone else in the room knew now. He had lied. And in that moment, his credibility crumbled. Judge Grayson cleared his throat loudly. That's enough, he said, voice tight. We'll take a brief recess. But Jalen knew the truth. They weren't taking a recess. They were giving the prosecution time to figure out how to recover from this disaster. But it was too late. Because everything had changed. The courtroom wasn't the same anymore. Not after the GPS revelation. Not after Detective Ruiz's silence. Judge Walter Grayson, once smug and dismissive, now shifted in his seat, tapping his fingers against the bench, something he did when he was nervous. And Jalen Dawson? He wasn't done yet. The moment recess ended, the judge's gavel hit the bench. Let's proceed, he said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Jalen stood, papers in hand, his expression unreadable. Your Honor, he began, measured and deliberate. We've established that the arresting officer wasn't even at the scene when he claimed to have seen me. We've established that the vehicle's owner confirmed I wasn't the one who stole it. He turned, walking slowly toward the prosecution's table. So now, let's talk about the other missing pieces of this case. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington stiffened. He knew where this was going. He just didn't know how to stop it. Jalen held up a thin stack of papers. These, he said, are forensic reports from the stolen vehicle. Carrington opened his mouth to object, but Jalen cut him off before he could speak. And before you say anything, he continued smoothly, let me clarify something important. The prosecution never called the forensic expert to testify. A collective gasp swept through the room. Judge Grayson froze mid-tap. Carrington's face tightened. The jury? Now they were paying attention. Jalen walked to the center of the courtroom, holding up the documents. The prosecution wants this jury to believe my fingerprints on the steering wheel mean I stole the car, he said. A pause. But you know what they didn't tell you? Another pause, longer this time. Jalen exhaled sharply. They never called the forensic expert who actually processed that evidence. Silence. Judge Grayson's eyes darted to Carrington. Carrington stayed frozen. Jalen flipped to a page in the report. If the prosecution was so confident in their evidence, he continued, his voice rising slightly, why didn't they bring in the forensic specialist who analyzed it? He let the question hang in the air. No one had an answer. Jalen pressed forward. If that expert were here, I'd ask them some very simple questions. Like how many other fingerprints were found in the car. He turned back to the judge. 2. I'd ask them why they didn't test for DNA evidence. I'd ask them why the fingerprints alone were considered proof of guilt. He looked straight at Carrington. But instead of bringing in that expert, the prosecution hoped this jury would just take their word for it. Carrington slammed his hand on the table. This is ridiculous, he snapped. The fingerprint evidence is conclusive. Then why didn't you bring in the expert? Jalen fired back instantly. Carrington hesitated. Jalen let out a small chuckle. That's what I thought. Judge Grayson pinched the bridge of his nose. This was bad. Really bad. Jalen had just proven. The arresting officer lied. The vehicle's owner contradicted the police report. The prosecution hid forensic inconsistencies. And suddenly, this case wasn't about a stolen car anymore. Jalen took a deep breath. Your Honor, he said, calmly but firmly. I'd also like to address something even more troubling. The judge looked up, wary. Go on. Jalen flipped to another document. The prosecution failed to mention that multiple witness statements contradict the police's version of events. Grayson's brows furrowed. Jalen held up another report. This, he said, his voice sharper now, is the testimony of a gas station employee who saw someone steal the Audi that night. Carrington's jaw clenched. Jalen read aloud. The man I saw running off in the stolen car had short blonde hair, light skin, and a green hoodie. Another ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. Jalen placed the paper firmly on the evidence table. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, he said, tilting his head, but I don't fit that description. Judge Grayson exhaled sharply. This wasn't just about one case anymore. This was about the entire system. A system that rushed to convict. A system that ignored evidence. A system that saw a young black man near the crime scene and decided he must be guilty. Grayson leaned back in his chair. For the first time, he looked at Jalen differently. Not as a defendant, but as someone exposing a failure in the very system Grayson had sworn to uphold. Jalen turned one last time to the jury. This case isn't just about me, he said, his voice steady but firm. It's about how easy it is to get convicted when no one bothers to look for the truth. For the first time since the trial began, Jalen Dawson wasn't on the defensive anymore. The smug confidence that once filled the prosecution's table? Gone. The quiet amusement from the judge? Now replaced with something closer to unease. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone in the courtroom felt it. Jalen took a slow step forward, turning to face the jury head-on. Then, he asked the one question that no one could ignore. How many cases like mine, he said, his voice clear and steady, have been decided before the trial even began? The air in the courtroom turned thick, almost suffocating. One juror, an older woman with graying hair, shifted in her seat. Another, a younger man in a navy suit, glanced toward the prosecution's table, but got no reassurance there. Even in the gallery, whispers rippled through the crowd, because the truth was hanging in the air now, undeniable. Jalen let the question breathe, let the weight of it settle. Then, he turned toward Judge Walter Grayson, who was suddenly avoiding his gaze. Jalen's tone softened, but not with weakness, with certainty. Your Honor, he said, slow and deliberate, when this trial started, you looked at me and saw a kid in trouble. A pause. You made assumptions, just like the police did, just like the prosecution did, just like the system has done, for years. Judge Grayson's fingers twitched against the bench, his face unreadable. Jalen didn't stop. But if I hadn't stood up for myself, if I hadn't demanded to see the GPS records, the forensic inconsistencies, the missing witness statements, another pause, I'd be on my way to prison right now. The courtroom was silent, but the energy was electric. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington couldn't take it anymore. This is a stunt, he snapped, his face red with frustration. The jury is here to examine the facts, not to listen to some grandstanding speech. The facts, Jalen interrupted, voice sharp. He turned, gesturing toward the jury again. The facts are that the officer who arrested me wasn't even at the crime scene. Murmurs from the crowd. The facts are that the car's owner described a different suspect. A juror rubbed his chin. The facts are that the prosecution didn't even bother bringing in the forensic expert to verify the evidence. Carrington opened his mouth, then closed it. Because what could he say? Every point Jalen made was the truth. Jalen took a deep breath, then looked back at the jury. Think about that, he said, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. If I didn't know my rights, if I didn't know how to defend myself, would anyone here have questioned what they were being told? He scanned their faces. Would anyone have fought for me? The jurors exchanged looks, some uncomfortably, some nodding just slightly. Judge Grayson cleared his throat. The authority in his voice wasn't as strong as before. Mr. Dawson, he said, you've made your point. Let's move to closing statements. Jalen nodded once, turning back to his table. But before he sat down, he said one final thing. This isn't just about me, he said. It's about how easy it is to get convicted when no one bothers to look for the truth. The courtroom was still. No one moved. No one spoke. Everyone was waiting. Judge Walter Grayson sat stiffly at the bench, fingers intertwined, a deep crease forming between his brows. He had walked into this trial thinking it was open and shut. But now he wasn't so sure of anything anymore. Jalen Dawson sat at the defendant's table, but he didn't feel like a defendant anymore. The evidence had crumbled. The prosecution had nothing left to stand on. And the judge? He knew what he had to do. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly, then picked up his gavel. A long pause. Then, "Case dismissed." The words echoed through the courtroom, bouncing off the walls like a gunshot. And just like that, it was over. The room erupted. Reporters in the gallery scrambled for their notepads. A juror shook his head, as if realizing how close they had come to convicting an innocent man. Even some of the officers in the back looked at each other uneasily. Because they all knew. Jalen Dawson shouldn't have had to fight this hard for the truth. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington stayed seated. His jaw locked so tight his teeth might crack. His case had fallen apart. And worse, a 19-year-old had done it to him. Jalen, however, didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't celebrate. He simply stood up, adjusted his shirt, and walked toward the exit. Because this wasn't a victory. It was justice. But just as Jalen reached the courtroom doors, a voice called out, "Mr. Dawson." He stopped, turned. Judge Grayson was watching him carefully now, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the judge sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "You should consider law school." A beat of silence. Then, finally, Jalen smirked. "Already have," he said. And with that, he walked out of the courtroom. Outside, the steps of the courthouse were packed with reporters, cameras flashing. Jalen stepped into the sunlight, blinking at the sudden brightness. His mother, Denise Dawson, stood at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, face unreadable. For a moment, Jalen wondered if she was about to scold him for risking everything. Instead, she simply shook her head and said, "Boy, you scared me half to death." Jalen chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She stared at him a second longer, then pulled him into a tight hug. "You always were the stubborn one," she murmured. Across the street, Judge Grayson watched from the courthouse window. His posture was different now. Less rigid, less superior, more thoughtful. He hadn't expected this trial to be anything more than routine. But now he knew he would never forget it. Because Jalen Dawson had done something most people never could. He had made the system look at itself. And for once, it had blinked first. Jalen walked away from the courthouse that day a free man. But he knew this wasn't the last time he'd stand in a courtroom. Next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be alone. Want more stories like this? If this story made you think, share it. Because the justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people. And people can change, but only if we make them. Hit that like button, subscribe for more, and let's keep the conversation going.